September 1939. Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and France declared war. The glittering world of Parisian entertainment suddenly faced an existential threat. The lights that had shone so brightly on the stages where Josephine performed were about to go dark. For many entertainers, the war meant retreating to safety, canceling performances, waiting for the storm to pass. But Josephine Baker made a different choice. She approached Jacques Abdi, the head of French military intelligence in Paris, and made an extraordinary offer. She wanted to spy for France. At first, military officials were skeptical. A famous entertainer? A woman? What could she possibly contribute to intelligence work? But Abdi and his colleagues quickly realized that Josephine Baker was exactly what they needed. Her fame was the perfect cover. Her international connections gave her access to places and people that traditional spies could never reach. And her intelligence, charm, and courage made her ideally suited for espionage work. Josephine's motivation was crystal clear. When asked why she was willing to risk her life, she said simply, "France made me what I am. I will be grateful forever. The people of Paris have given me everything. I am ready to give them my life." And that's exactly what she prepared to do. During the period known as the Phony War, the months between September 1939 and May 1940 when major combat hadn't yet begun, Josephine went to work. Her first assignment was to attend parties and social gatherings where Italian and Japanese officials were present. At the time, France was trying to assess whether these nations would remain neutral or join forces with Germany. Imagine the scene. Glittering embassy receptions, champagne flowing, important men in uniform and diplomatic attire. And there, at the center of attention, was Josephine Baker, the famous entertainer, charming everyone with her stories and her laughter. What no one realized was that she was listening intently to every conversation, carefully noting who said what, observing who was meeting with whom, and memorizing details that she would later report to French intelligence. She was a natural. People were so dazzled by her celebrity that they let their guards down. They said things in her presence that they would never have revealed to an obvious intelligence operative. And Josephine had an extraordinary memory. She could recall conversations word for word, details of insignias and uniforms, snippets of information that seemed trivial but could be pieced together to reveal larger intelligence pictures. But her work was about to become far more dangerous. In May 1940, Germany launched its invasion of France. The speed and ferocity of the Nazi blitzkrieg shocked the world. Within 6 weeks, France had fallen. The government collapsed, and on June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany. The country was divided. The north and west, including Paris, were directly occupied by Nazi forces, while the south became Vichy France, a puppet state that collaborated with the Nazis. For Josephine Baker, this was a moment of profound crisis. The France she loved was under Nazi occupation. The same racial ideologies that had driven her from America were now being imposed on her adopted homeland. The Nazis despised everything she represented, a black woman who had achieved success and freedom, who embodied the cultural diversity and openness that they sought to destroy. Many people fled France or went into hiding. But Josephine made a different choice. She would continue fighting, now as part of the French resistance and the Free French forces led by Charles de Gaulle from exile. Her handler, Jacques Abdi, became Captain Abdi of the Free French forces, and Josephine Baker became one of his most valuable agents. Operating under Nazi occupation required a completely different kind of espionage. The stakes were life and death. If Josephine was caught, she wouldn't face a trial. She would be executed, probably tortured first to reveal her contacts and operations. But Josephine's fame continued to be her greatest asset. Even the Nazis recognized her celebrity status. When they occupied Paris, they actually invited her to perform in Germany. They wanted to use her as propaganda, to show that the Nazi regime appreciated culture and talent. Of course, Josephine refused. She would never perform for the people who were trying to destroy everything she loved. Instead, she moved to Les Milans, her château in the Dordogne region in southern France, in the so-called Free Zone of Vichy France. This became her base of operations. The château, with its many rooms and remote location, was perfect for hiding refugees, particularly Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. Josephine used her home as a safe house, sheltering people who were being hunted simply because of their religion or their opposition to the Nazis. But her most important work involved intelligence gathering and transmission. And this is where the story gets truly fascinating. Josephine traveled extensively during the war years, using her celebrity status as a performer to cross borders and move through territories where ordinary citizens couldn't go. She would attend parties at embassies, perform at venues where officials gathered, and use these opportunities to collect information about Nazi movements, military installations, and collaboration networks. The brilliant part was how she transmitted this information. She would write intelligence reports in invisible ink on her sheet music. Think about that for a moment. Josephine Baker, the famous entertainer, traveling with her sheet music, which everyone would expect her to carry. No one would think twice about it. But hidden on those pages, written in invisible ink that could only be revealed with specific chemicals, were details about German troop movements, airfield locations, and Nazi official activities. When she crossed borders, guards would look at her papers, see that she was the famous Josephine Baker, perhaps ask for an autograph and wave her through. They never suspected that she was carrying some of the most sensitive intelligence information of the war. She also used her connections to help resistance fighters. She would pass messages, provide money from her own substantial fortune to fund operations, and use her château as a meeting place for resistance organizers. Her position was unique. She was famous enough that the authorities were reluctant to harass her too openly, but she used that protective shield to help people who had no such protection. In late 1940, Abdi and Josephine made the dangerous journey from France to Spain and then to Portugal, eventually reaching North Africa. This wasn't a vacation. It was an intelligence mission. Portugal was neutral during the war, which made it a hotbed of espionage activity. Spies from all sides operated in Lisbon, and Josephine's presence there allowed her to gather information from multiple sources. In North Africa, she continued her work supporting the Free French forces. She performed for troops to maintain morale, but she was also gathering intelligence and serving as a courier for sensitive information. The French territories in North Africa were crucial strategic locations, and the battle for their loyalty, whether they would side with Vichy France or the Free French, was critically important. During this period, Josephine became seriously ill. She contracted a severe infection and underwent multiple surgeries. For months she was bedridden, and at times it seemed she might not survive. But even from her hospital bed, she continued her intelligence work. Her illness actually provided excellent cover. People would visit her to pay their respects, to check on the famous performer, and she would use these visits to pass information and coordinate resistance activities. Some historians believe she may have prolonged her convalescence deliberately, using it as cover for her espionage work. Whether that's true or not, what's certain is that Josephine Baker never stopped fighting, even when her body was failing her. By 1943, the war had reached a turning point. The Allied forces were gaining ground. The United States had entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Soviet forces had stopped the Nazi advance at Stalingrad. In North Africa, Allied forces were pushing back against Axis control. And throughout this period, Josephine Baker was there. She had recovered from her illness, though it had taken a tremendous toll on her health. But she was determined to see France liberated, and she threw herself into the effort with renewed energy. She performed extensively for Allied troops throughout North Africa. These weren't just entertainment performances. They were morale operations. Soldiers far from home, facing the horrors of war, found joy and hope in Josephine's shows. She reminded them what they were fighting for: freedom, culture, humanity, the right to laugh and dance and live without fear. She also continued her intelligence work. She traveled to Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt, always gathering information, always making connections, always serving as a courier when needed. She wore the uniform of the Free French Air Force, having been officially enlisted as a sub-lieutenant. Later, she was promoted to lieutenant. Think about what this meant. Josephine Baker, who had been born in poverty in segregated St. Louis, who had fled America because of its racism, was now an officer in the French military, fighting against fascism and racial hatred on a global scale. When the Allied forces landed in Sicily in July 1943 and began the liberation of Europe, Josephine was there. When Rome fell to the Allies in June 1944, she performed for the troops celebrating the liberation. And when the Allied forces landed in Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, beginning the final push to liberate France, Josephine waited anxiously for news, knowing that the country she loved was finally going to be free. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. The Nazi occupation that had lasted 4 years was finally over. General Charles de Gaulle led Free French forces in a triumphant march down the Champs-Élysées. The nightmare was ending. For Josephine, this was the fulfillment of everything she had worked for. The country that had given her freedom and dignity had been saved. The forces of racial hatred and totalitarianism had been defeated, and she had played her part in that victory. But her work wasn't quite done yet. After the war ended in 1945, the full scope of Josephine Baker's contributions began to emerge. French military intelligence officers confirmed that she had been one of their most effective and courageous agents. She had risked her life repeatedly, used her personal fortune to support the resistance, and never asked for anything in return. In 1946, France officially recognized her service. She received the Croix de Guerre, a military decoration for bravery. She was also awarded the Rosette de la Résistance, recognizing her work with the French resistance. And years later, in 1961, she was made a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur, France's highest order of merit, by Charles de Gaulle himself. At the ceremony, de Gaulle acknowledged what Josephine had done during the war. This woman who had started life with nothing, who had been treated as less than human in her birth country, was now being honored as a hero by the nation she had saved. But Josephine didn't rest on her laurels. The rest of her life was dedicated to fighting the same forces of hatred and discrimination that had motivated her wartime service. She became a prominent civil rights activist, working alongside American leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and participating in the March on Washington in 1963, where she wore her Free French uniform and spoke to the crowd. She also created what she called her Rainbow Tribe, adopting 12 children from different ethnic backgrounds and raising them together at Les Millons as a living demonstration that people of all races could live together in harmony. It was an idealistic vision, and while it had its challenges and complications, it showed Josephine's commitment to a better world. She returned to the United States multiple times to perform, but she insisted on performing only in integrated venues. In the 1950s, when much of America was still segregated, this was a radical stance. She canceled shows at venues that refused to admit black audience members. She used her celebrity status to challenge American racism, just as she had used it to fight Nazi tyranny. Her career had its ups and downs in the post-war years. She faced financial difficulties and eventually lost her beloved château. But she never stopped performing, and audiences never stopped loving her. She made a triumphant comeback in the 1970s, performing in Paris to sold-out crowds who remembered her glory days and celebrated her enduring spirit. On April 12, 1975, Josephine Baker performed at the Bobino Theatre in Paris, celebrating 50 years in show business. The performance was a triumph. Standing ovations, celebrities in attendance, a reminder that she was still a star. Just 2 days later, on April 14, 1975, Josephine Baker died of a cerebral hemorrhage. She was 68 years old. France gave her a state funeral, with military honors. She was the first American-born woman to receive this recognition. Thousands of people lined the streets of Paris to pay their respects. But the recognition didn't end there. In November 2021, nearly 50 years after her death, Josephine Baker was inducted into the Pantheon in Paris, the final resting place for France's greatest heroes. She became the first black woman to receive this honor, joining figures like Voltaire, Rousseau, Victor Hugo, and Marie Curie. President Emmanuel Macron gave a speech acknowledging her extraordinary life. She was born American, chose France, and the whole world admires her. Josephine Baker fought so many fights with lightness, with freedom, with joy. The ceremony was powerful and symbolic. A cenotaph was installed in the Pantheon. Her body remained in Monaco, where she had been buried, but her memory now resides in the most sacred space of French history. Think about the arc of that life. From the slums of St. Louis to the Pantheon. From a child working as a domestic servant, enduring abuse and poverty, to a spy who helped defeat the Nazis. From a dancer who scandalized audiences to a civil rights icon who marched for justice. Josephine Baker's story matters because it shows us what courage looks like. Real courage isn't just charging into battle. It's using whatever tools you have, whatever position you occupy, to fight for what's right. Josephine used her fame, her charm, her intelligence, and her indomitable spirit to resist tyranny and hatred. Her story also matters because it reminds us that heroes come from unexpected places. The intelligence agencies initially doubted that a famous entertainer could be an effective spy. But Josephine understood something profound. Sometimes the best disguise is being exactly who you are, just in a different context. And her story matters because it shows the power of gratitude and loyalty. France gave Josephine Baker the freedom and dignity that America had denied her. And when France needed her, she gave everything. Her safety, her fortune, her life if necessary, to protect it. That's the story of Josephine Baker. Entertainer, spy, hero. A woman who danced on stages and in the shadows, who wore both banana skirts and military uniforms, who proved that you don't have to be one thing or the other. You can be everything. The next time you think about World War II espionage, remember that some of the most important intelligence wasn't gathered by men in trench coats in dark alleys. It was gathered by a woman in a glamorous dress at a party, listening carefully, remembering everything, and then writing it all down in invisible ink on her sheet music. Josephine Baker changed history. One dance, one secret, one act of courage at a time.